thank you, Justin, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And good evening, Anne. It's great to have you here. Look, let's start right in. We haven't got a whole lot of time, but let me start with a topic that I think is dear to your heart. I think we all agree the threat from cyber threat actors is insidious and persistent. It's a low bar for entry, and of course, there are no geographic bounds. Our adversaries range from criminal actors to state and state-sponsored malicious actors. Australia joined the Counter-Ransomware Initiative as a founding member, which the US established in 2021. Can you share with us your views on the impact of international mobilisation efforts like the CRI and how they can amplify our efforts and how you think they're going to impact the landscape around us?
Absolutely. So first, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. And I must say, it feels very appropriate that it's morning in Australia as we're speaking, because I always find whenever we in America are working really hard on a global issue and we're tired, we're worn out, it's morning in Australia and our Australian colleagues come on fully energized, fully ready to go and partner. So it feels most appropriate to do that here. So as you noted, the White House, we established the Counter-Ransomware Initiative 4 years ago. And the thought in my mind when we first established it was to say, cybersecurity threats, notably ransomware threats, are transnational. They cross all borders. You could have a set of actors in one set of countries, in practice largely in Russia, using infrastructure in a number of countries. We see that all over the world, conducting attacks on hospitals, on pipelines, on businesses, and on governments all over the world. So no one country can tackle this together. It needs an international partnership. And as we built the Counter-Ransomware Initiative, I reached out to our closest allies to ask them to join us in standing it up. And as you said, Australia was a founding member. And indeed, Australia took on running the task force, the practical work to bring governments together to disrupt actors and infrastructure, to come up with creative ways. Because deterring actors, particularly ransomware actors, is incredibly difficult. There is any number of insecure infrastructure. Companies are often willing to pay a ransom. Indeed, in the United States, $1.3 billion was paid in ransomware attacks in 2023 alone. So that transnational partnership on policy, on disruptive operations, and on creative ideas in terms of intelligence sharing and information sharing is key. So as you noted, we have our 4th annual meeting coming up, really the end of this month in Washington, D.C. It's grown to 70 nations, Interpol, the European Union coming together. We have an aggressive set of policies, disruption operations, and activities that we will be discussing to deepen that partnership.
Yeah, thank you. And do you think there is a silver bullet here? As governments stop paying ransoms, and moving forward, do you think that we can actually change the landscape of those threat actors? And what do you think the flow-on effects are?
It's a great question. I don't think there's any one silver bullet. I think it's 3 sets of activities working together. One, we need to improve domestic cybersecurity. In the United States, we've moved to mandates for critical infrastructure, requiring ports and airports and airlines and pipelines do minimum cybersecurity practices, because one can't secure a home if we're not even locking the doors. And we've learned a lot from Australia's legislation in this way as well, which has really been, I think, groundbreaking in terms of what it's enabled you in Australia to do. The second piece is building the partnership. So one of the most exciting part of the Counter-Ransomware Initiative really is this joint platform which Israel and the UAE established for all Counter-Ransomware Initiative members to share information, to share indicators of compromise, to ask for help in the middle of a cyber attack, and for countries to provide that help. And we're also thinking about establishing a fund for that as well. So that partnership, so countries learned from each other, and so attackers have to recreate the attack each time. They can't just reuse it. And then the final piece is the joint policy options. So at the meeting at the end of this month, there will be countries proposing policies around insurance, policies around joint statements on attribution, policies around what countries' resilience approaches should be related to ransomware. And the more countries that partner on that policy, for example, best practices for insurance companies to incentivize cybersecurity, and then looking to say, how do we institutionalize that, the more effective we are, because we bring a body of countries together on common approaches.
Yeah, collaboration is so critical, and I think we'll come back to chat about that in a second. Particularly, it was mentioned yesterday in the forum by Admiral Mike Rogers, the criticality of cybersecurity as a forum to collaborate. I think there's a great opportunity. Very quickly, last thing on deterrence or these frameworks, the lockbit takedown was a really interesting case. And I'm wondering what you see as its major impact, not only as a global operation that was conducted, but also the effect of that takedown.
You know, the lockbit takedown was both promising and sobering. Promising in that the part of it where law enforcement shared the decryptor key with hundreds of victims, enabling them to decrypt locked networks, and the disruption and the takedown was very promising. The sobering part was that the impact and the time period was very limited. We soon saw that actor back up and conducting cyber attacks. So disruptions are important. Fostering distrust within the ransomware ecosystem is important, but we shouldn't think that any one disruption activity is going to be the silver bullet. It's part of the set of activities along with cybersecurity, along with coordinated policies, along with considering how do we reduce and drive down ransom payments, which fundamentally incentivize ransom attacks. Disruption operations are a tool, a very important tool, but one of the tools needed to fight growing ransomware attacks.
Yeah, we're hoping to pass legislation this year in Australia that addresses 4 issues. One of them is the reporting of ransomware payments, just to better understand the quantum and how that financial model is really underpinning the cyber ecosystem. So, but let's move to collaboration. Under the Australian 2023-2030 cyber strategy, we envisage a future where every individual business and industry has the skills and resources to actually be cyber secure. Love to talk about your perspectives on that.
Absolutely. First, I would very much commend the work that Australia did in your legislation. I know the amount of work that went in by Australian colleagues in getting buy-in, providing the briefings, working with your legislator to get that support. And it is incredibly important because national cybersecurity crosses many sectors. It crosses water and ports, it crosses the military and the commercial side. So a broad base of understanding in the legislator is key to enduring impact there. In the United States, we took a different approach. President Biden felt very strongly following the Colonial Pipeline attack in May of 2021 that we could not have that level of risk where the major pipeline serving the entire East Coast could be disrupted by criminal actors. You could have a company with really inadequate cybersecurity given the rising attacks that we were seeing. And as a result, we in the United States began looking at our safety regulations and interpreting them to expand them to cybersecurity. Because whether you have mechanical signaling systems or digital signaling systems for railroads, clearly we want safety rules to ensure that a mechanical system can't be disrupted or a digital system can't be disrupted. So that was the way we moved sector by sector, working with the sector regulators. And I think the lesson we learned, and I'm eager, Michelle, to hear yours, is that there is no one size fits all. There's no one regulatory approach to every sector because what it takes to secure a water system is different from what it takes to secure a pipeline or turn back on a pipeline after a cyber attack. So the role of individual regulators who understand the sector, understand existing practices, is really key. And I think we've shifted our national approach from an approach on issuing cybersecurity advisors and voluntary practices alone to complementing that with a regulatory approach. The partnership between agencies like CISA with each of our sector regulators is a critical one for us to continue to strengthen and build, because that combined approach, both voluntary with the private sector, but also for critical companies, ensuring there are minimum mandates, ensuring that we're auditing them, ensuring that we're sharing sensitive threat information when there are threats that could disrupt the critical services our citizens rely on, is very important. Yeah, I'm eager to hear what you learned as well, because you've learned a great deal.
Hey, thanks, Anne. And I couldn't agree more with you that actually collaboration across the entire nation is critical. The cyber threat poses, and I often say, it's a national security issue. It's about stability, security and prosperity. Let me give you 3 examples of where we're targeting, because I think there are different groups across our nation. The first, I'm using my power to convene really across industry to bring together Australia's largest organisations and pink bodies to really get after rapid information sharing. And this is an area where government doesn't want to get in the middle of this, where we will slow it down, and actually having industry identify solutions for industry and drive forward. So there's some great initiatives that we're trialling across there with working groups looking at our workforce, looking at sovereign capabilities, looking at emerging tech, and looking at sovereign capability, emerging tech workforce, and also how to support small businesses. So that's big side of industry. We have the Threat Information Sharing Network, which we've set up across the critical infrastructure sector, which is really critical to working with them in ensuring we're rapidly sharing threats and understanding on how to combat those threats, and also exercising across our critical infrastructure sectors. And thirdly, we're really targeting small businesses as a key and vulnerable sector to cybersecurity threats. So we're looking to uplift small businesses, build their resilience, program called Cyber Wardens, where we're really looking to provide the tools for small businesses, and in fact every individual across Australia, to have the confidence to be able to secure their own cyber posture online, and also the resilience to bounce back, knowing that we're not going to stop, as you said, all attacks.
And that is absolutely, I look forward to learning more about the Cyber Wardens program. We've learned 2 really interesting lessons in working with the private sector. One was that to your point, our smallest businesses, our rural hospitals, our schools with less than 2,500 children, they often lack the trained staff and are fearful of taking the steps needed to secure their networks. However, talk about the impact, right? Rural hospitals in the United States are often the only hospital for miles around. So if a hospital's operations are disrupted, as we see they are, that disrupts medical care for Americans living within miles. Similarly, schools with less than 2,500 children, they still have children's sensitive medical records, as psychological records, which children went for counseling. So we reached out to key private sector players in the United States and formed a partnership where they've launched free cybersecurity programs for the nation's 1,800 rural hospitals, as well as the nation's schools with less than 2,500 children. And that partnership has already started to have impact. We launched, for example, the hospital one earlier this summer, and we have 350 of the 1,800 hospitals in the country already both leveraging the training and the free cybersecurity tech. So that showed us that companies will step up to partner. And as a lesson we had learned a couple of years earlier in Ukraine, where after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the evening before the invasion, Russia conducted a cyber attack. We were very concerned, given the past history of ongoing Russian cyber attacks. And we saw the US and private sector across Europe and Australia really surge to provide support, moving Ukrainian data out of the country into the cloud. So there was resilience, rapidly deploying aggressive endpoint security, which then served to benefit us all. Because any destructive, like wiper attacks that we started to see, companies that deploy those cybersecurity protections are global players. So once they see it once, they could deploy it globally. So it actually ended up both protecting countries around the world in the most effective way. So that taught us that ensuring that endpoint detection, data encryption, data resilience in the cloud, thinking about data resilience in the cloud as well as resilience to potential cuts of undersea cables are approaches we all need in our national cyber resilience approaches.
No, that just speaks volumes of the criticality of our partnership, because I think we have so many shared experiences and learning so much from each other. Can I change track before we move to questions and just talk about your perspectives on how do we leverage the immense value of emerging tech, the social and economic value of interconnectedness and new and emerging technologies, and balance that with the security of increasing our risk surface for cyber. So our security of devices, Internet of Things, new capabilities, both mandatory and voluntary. How are you using your power to convene to push standards across the US?
One of the programs I'm most proud of that we've worked on over the last really 18 months is a program called the Cyber Trust Mark program. anything that endures needs to build within the ecosystem of tech companies, government, and consumers or companies buying tech. That triangle, if we can find the right set of incentives, then it endures even more so because the tech stays updated. So the Cyber Trust Mark program builds on a program that really was pioneered by Singapore and Finland. A shout out to those countries who are really pioneers, to say that any Internet of Things devices that meet the government cybersecurity standard and are tested can bear a government label. In the United States, we have a program called Energy Star, which for any electrical devices that meet energy efficiency standards and are tested to it, they bear that star. We may not necessarily know what those energy efficiency standards are, but we know that those are, when you look for that star, you know that it meets those standards. So we essentially are replicating that for cyber. We launched the program at the White House a year ago in August, and companies from Google to LG to Samsung announced that they would be participating. And we then worked through the various legal requirements for the program that was needed, and it just launched 2 weeks ago. So now the program is live in the United States. The FCC, who is the administrator as the agency for connected devices, is selecting an administrator for the program, and very shortly companies will be able to submit their products. And our hope is that we will have labeled products in stores this winter. It's really exciting because our goal would be, and we worked with the European Union to ensure that if a product is tested in the US or in Europe, it can be sold in either market. So what we bring together on that triangle is consumers who want to buy secure baby monitors, secure home alarm systems, businesses who want to buy secure routers, companies who are willing to build a more secure product to ensure that they maintain and patch those products, but want a way to differentiate their product. They want a way to show consumers, look, we built more secure. We've gone to the trouble of getting it tested. And that's where we in government come in by certifying the labs and allowing the government label to be used. So it's a program I'm really excited about. We're talking with Australia within the Quad context of working on labeling together. And it's a good example of where there's such a scale. There are millions, hundreds of millions of Internet of Things devices, but our goal is driving that. And the final piece is, our goal is also saying we in government then will only buy labeled devices at a point in time when the market has generated them. We hope 12 to 18 months from now.
Yeah, that is super exciting. Certainly mandatory standards are part of our legislation that we're pushing through this session as well. And we found that the critical part of that is really co-design and working with industry to get there and setting both mandatory but also voluntary standards to really push and meet. And I think, as you said, across the Quad, across other partnerships, across our region, sharing those standards really does bring a scale so that we can start having confidence in the systems that we're bringing into our homes, so we can leverage that economic and social benefit as well as be secure. Such an important issue.
And I would note that it has significant national security impact because we see adversaries, whether countries or criminals, leverage the hundreds of millions of unsecure devices to build covert infrastructure. And that's covert infrastructure that's stood up to conduct attacks, and then they stand it down and move to the next. And it's what makes attribution difficult. It's what makes tracing cyber attacks difficult. So the more we can reduce the number of vulnerable devices through programs like labeling, like Cyber Trust Mark, the more over time, and it won't happen in a day or even a year, but the more over time we make it harder for adversaries to build these massive covert infrastructure networks and conduct attacks with impunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Very briefly before we go to questions, it might be interesting to note my team and I manage about 6 incidents at any one time across the economy that are typically about data breaches, and typically the consequences vary, and they vary in their public effect, they vary in the impact and the visibility they have. But I found the CrowdStrike incident to be a little more relevant in terms of actually preparing for a cyber incident as opposed to a data breach. And I'm really super interested in what you learned. For us, it impacted about 1% of our systems, yet it truly showed us what an outage could do. And we saw a lot of industries learning lessons about interconnectivity, network connections, supply chain and vulnerabilities. I'm just interested in your reflections on moving into that preparing for cyber incidences, cyber security incidents, rather than managing data breaches, which is where I spend a lot of my time.
Absolutely. So when the White House Situation Room called me at 4 a.m. that morning, the first impacts were in Australia. And we know that Australia was particularly impacted because you come up first, and those networks came up first. We had massive impact in the United States, the ones people are very aware of, airlines, but also our hospital sector was badly hit. Our national security community tests patches before they're deployed and delays that, so they were not impacted. However, it highlighted to us that really we needed standards for testing between different companies, if multiple companies were doing patches at the same time, for scaling rollout, so that if one set of customers is impacted, one can clearly identify that and potentially pause the larger rollout and then rollbacks. It also has raised questions about how cybersecurity vendors and large-scale software companies interact. And I think all of us who've built tech know that there but for the grace of God go I, right? It was any number of companies who lack those standard best practices in testing and scaling and a rollback. So I convened a group of key CEOs along with my partner as the National Cyber Director to get their input on what was needed. And we have a draft set of requirements in this space, which we continue to discuss. And as we work on a second Biden administration cybersecurity executive order for the fall, we intend to roll in some of those best practices on testing of updates, scaling of updates, cooperation across the sector, and rollback procedures, because our digital infrastructure underlies our entire economy and underlies our entire national security today. And we need to have the confidence that when we roll out patches, when we do updates, we understand and the companies understand the risk and have procedures to manage the risk if something goes wrong.
Yeah, fantastic. Can't wait to engage further on your executive order and see how that goes. I'd also say I think everyone in the room can relate. It's not Friday afternoon if it isn't a crisis. So it was excellent to be part of that moving forward, and I'm incredibly proud of how Australia responded using our mechanisms, our national coordination mechanism. I think that brings us to...
Deservedly, very deservedly.
Thanks, Anne. I think that brings us to questions in the audience. I can't see, and I know people said that yesterday, but I generally can't. Perfect. So if anyone has a question, I encourage you to use the microphone nice and close so Anne can hear the question as well. And let us know if you have a particular preference for who you'd like to answer it. Oh, I think I can see one down here.
Michelle, Anne, thank you very much for that session, and congratulations on that counter ransomware initiative. Adam Turner, I'm a researcher in ransomware payments, so I'm very curious to know your thoughts on how we can continue to impose cost on the nefarious actors and their payment networks, and what we might be looking at beyond the mandatory reporting element that is due to be introduced. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Let me start and then I'll hand to Anne. It's really important that we understand the quantum, which is what the new reporting, mandatory reporting, is going to get after. I will say that by May this year, in terms of impact, by May this year, Australia had participated in more attributions and sanctions than we had in the whole of 2023. So our cyber strategy says that we will attribute and we will call out bad actors when we have the evidence to do so and it's in our national interest. So that's a serious body of work that I collaborate with our ambassador for cyber, Brendan, here as well, and something that we're absolutely ramping up. I think it's having an effect. I think across the ransomware landscape, it is having an effect. You know, the two sanctions that we've given to two Russians, which have been shared with many of our partners, makes it really hard for them to travel and to engage in this. But it also says to, I think it puts other actors on warning. No one can pay Ermakov or Khrushchev through cryptocurrency or any kind of money there. I think it's having an impact. I think it is actually demonstrating that you need to, that we're going to pursue wherever your threat actors are. We're going to do everything we can to pursue them. Anne, what are your thoughts?
I think you put it so well. And building on the point regarding deterring the actors, disrupting the infrastructure, The third point I would add is the potential victims. We know that companies that do backups can recover faster. Companies that encrypt their data can't be blackmailed because even high-performance computers cannot break AES 256. Companies that have endpoint monitoring are more likely to find the attacker and push them out of the network faster. So there are things companies can do to not only make it less likely that they're successfully attacked, but also make them able to recover faster without having to pay a ransom, which we know just incentivizes the next attack on another company and another hospital and another pipeline. So things we're thinking about and talking with Australia is how do we incentivize companies to take the steps they need to do to make it less likely that they'll be victims? What are the steps we can do to decrease the number of ransom payments, to decrease the size of ransom payments? In the United States, you may have seen recently that the Securities and Exchange Commission noted that even if a company is attacked and pays a ransom, they still have to disclose the incident, because we're trying to, in that old line about sunshine is the best disinfectant, we're trying to require companies not only to report privately to us, but also to have to publicly report to their shareholders, we had to pay a ransom to criminals because we weren't prepared. We weren't taking these steps. So I think that's the final part of it. And we're all thinking about the carrots and the sticks. Clearly the incentives get companies to pay, and that's where some of the work with insurance companies is coming in. But also the sticks, by requiring them to report it publicly so that executives are asked by their shareholders, and others, why wasn't the data encrypted? Why wasn't endpoint monitoring?
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely are seeking to break that economic cycle that promotes further ransoms and also build that exact resilience so that companies aren't vulnerable to it. Is there another question? A couple over here.
Thank you very much, Michelle, Anne. Very insightful things. My name is Aviram Atzaba. I'm from the Israeli National Cyber Directorate. And I'm happy to be here and hear things from the other side of the world and see that so many similarities. I would like to stress one thing that we are currently within it, which is the war that we are. And in the last year, we saw terrorism using cyberspace as a terror tool against population, against nations, against democracy. How do you see this cyber change in your areas, and how do you get ready or prepare for the usage of cyberspace for actors like terrorism?
Hey, thank you for your question. And let me throw that one to you first.
Absolutely. So first, Aviram, as President Biden said today, we mourn the brutal murder by Hamas of 6 hostages in Israel, including an Israeli-American hostage. No individual should have to face what they faced in kidnapping and being brutally executed by Hamas terrorists as well. So we mourn with your nation, including the one Israeli-American hostage as well. With regard to your question, we saw, for example, the evening before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Russia conducted a cyber attack on commercial satellite systems because they were a provider of services for Ukraine's military. We've seen it as well in cyber attacks by Iran against water systems in the United States. So I think we all see that the traditional divide between civilian and military, the contours of conflict and of the battlefield has changed to where homeland and battleground, civilian and military, is blurred in cyberspace. And it leads to many policy questions. It's the reason in the United States, and I know in Israel and certainly in Australia, governments have put a significant focus on improving the cybersecurity of critical infrastructure. Because we know that whether in conflict, in crisis, or in peacetime, our citizens need that infrastructure to be operable. It's led us to say, how do we ensure that in hospital networks we constrain, we reduce the number of connections to the internet? It may be that we make it harder for individuals working in certain sectors to work from home, because we know that the more open connections, and we know certainly that China and other countries are targeting security infrastructure, the more open connections, the more opportunities for compromise. So, and then when we move to international norms, it prompts discussions regarding norms. And we certainly see, whether it's Russian criminal attackers attacking and disrupting hospitals in the United States, or other attacks against civilian infrastructure, we know the international norms in cyberspace, while they exist, they are largely not enforced. So discussions around how do we enforce those? The first step is attribution, and more nations joining that attribution. But then how do we enforce those norms in cyberspace to ensure that the critical infrastructure our citizens rely on can be protected?
Yeah, thanks, Anne. I think that's a fantastic answer. I couldn't do it better in terms of working closely and collaborating across our critical infrastructure to help harden them, as well as those vulnerable sectors. We look at our health sector, it's such a data-rich environment, and you've pointed out small hospitals, which are, there's a scale relative issue here, but of course they're so vulnerable, and we've seen them being targeted increasingly over the last couple of years. We are so close to time, and I was asked to actually share what I think might be one final reflection, or we might have lost Anne, a concrete action to improve cybersecurity. Anne, have we lost you? We've lost Anne. I think I was desperate to hear her final reflection on one concrete action to improve. For my money, I'd say that we need to actually change our mindset about cybersecurity. We actually need to move cybersecurity from being a deeply technical or intimidating topic to being so accessible and something that all of us are actually focused on, making it a whole of nation endeavour. In the same way that a CEO considers financial risk, we need to be considering cyber risk. It's about leadership, it's about priorities, it's about strategy. It must be accessible across the whole economy and a key focus for all industries, small and large. With that, we're out of time, and thank you very much.